Right. So is it on the title slide? Just making sure that.
Yep. Yep.
All right.
Good.
Perfect.
All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our third and final webinar of our spring webinar series. This is Public Libraries and Fake News, How to Educate and Inform in the Age of Disinformation. I'm Jamie Machik with the Wisconsin Valley Library Service, and helping me out today is Leah Langby with the IFLIS Library System. So as I mentioned, this is our third webinar in our series. We're very excited to have Molzahn and Barbara Alvarez with us today presenting. They're going to be talking about a lot of information during this webinar, and they will take questions at the end. So if you have questions, feel free to submit those in the chat or question area, and we will make sure we get to it. So Sam and Barbara, please begin.
All right. As Jamie said, our title topic is Public Libraries and Fake News, How to Educate and Inform in the Age of Disinformation. There we go. Our agenda today is we're going to have our little introduction. We're going to discuss and define what fake news, misinformation, and disinformation all are, how it is created, and why that matters. And then we'll transition to the role of the public library, how to educate our communities, and give you some resources, and then end with concluding thoughts and question and answer. So if you want to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll answer those at the end. All right, so as Jamie said, I'm Sam Molzahn. I'm currently in the Milwaukee County Federated Library System as a reference librarian at the Franklin Public Library. I've been teaching fake news, disinformation classes to the general public for about 5 years. And I mainly focus on how to educate our communities and how to incorporate that into public libraries.
Hi, everybody. My name's Barbara Alvarez. I'm really excited to be here. I have been writing about fake news, misinformation, and disinformation for about 6 years. I've published 2 feature pieces in Public Libraries magazine about the role of public libraries and fake news. I'm a library and information science instructor, and I have been in this field for over 10 years. So I'm thrilled to be here and to talk with all of you about these concepts. So the first thing that we're going to do, Sam and I are going to take turns talking about these different talking about different areas of fake news, misinformation, and disinformation, how it connects to the libraries. My part is going to be talking about the grounding piece about what fake news is and why this matters. And then Sam is going to be talking about how you can connect this to your library services and programs. So the first thing that I want to touch on is what is fake news versus misinformation and disinformation. So often fake news is used interchangeably with misinformation and disinformation. And fake news really is an umbrella for misinformation and disinformation. But misinformation and disinformation have distinct definitions. So Sam, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so I want to talk to you a little bit about what disinformation is specifically. Disinformation is deliberately misleading or biased information. It's a manipulated narrative or manipulating facts. It's essentially propaganda. So disinformation knows that this is not true. It knows that it's misleading. It is intended to be misleading. It is intended to be propaganda. Next slide. So how does that connect with what misinformation is? Misinformation is simply false information. And there might be an intent to deceive, there might not. You and I and every single person in this room has spread misinformation at some point in our lives, whether we accidentally attributed a quote to the wrong person, we gave somebody wrong directions, we had a fact wrong, something like that. Misinformation is simply false information. Disinformation is knowingly false. Now, the blurred line here is when we enter the world of social media. Propaganda machines, they are intentionally putting out misleading, biased information out there. and people are unwittingly sharing it on social media. It's so easy now to just hit that share button. You and I probably all do it. We've all probably done it at least once this week. If you have social media in any capacity, you've probably screenshotted something, shared something, commented, liked, and that could have been misinformation. So that's where that blurred line comes in, is the people that are knowingly creating this propaganda and the people that are spreading it thinking that this is true. This is where we have the umbrella term for fake news. So fake news encompasses anything that is inaccurate. That means disinformation is fake news, misinformation is fake news. So that's what we're talking about today, is essentially just fake news. But we are also going to be touching on why fake news is so harmful. So let's go into the next slide and talk about, how does this even come about? In this section, I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of fake news, because fake news did not come on the scene when the term became popular 6 years ago. Fake news has been around forever, and it's not going to go anywhere. So this means it's a really important aspect for us as librarians to be aware of, to educate ourselves on, and to be knowledgeable about. So next slide. Let's talk a little bit about fake news through time. So to be sure, fake news is nothing new, but it certainly is much more easy to share, and it's much more accessible given the technology that we have in 2022 and the social media platforms we have. One of the first examples of somebody just purposely talking about creating fake news that I wanted to include here is William Randolph Hearst, who was a publishing tycoon in the early 1900s. During the Spanish-American War in Cuba, he sent photojournalists down to Cuba to take pictures of things so that they could spread news articles all about the United States, about what was going on there. The photojournalist came back and said, there was really nothing going on. I don't have pictures to take. He said, you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war. As a result, the Spanish-American War is considered the first media war. It's the first time that the media really was part of creating this narrative, whether it was true or not, and spreading it to the masses. But fake news is also used all the time to try and justify certain policies and certain regulations. For example, voting rights. After the Civil War ended, we entered Reconstruction, when Black Americans were able to vote. All of a sudden, now we have literacy tests and poll taxes. We're still seeing a lot of ways that marginalized folks are being segregated from voting rights because of fake news, because people are spreading false information about the ability to vote and who should be able to vote. Another example that I want to share about how harmful this fake news, this disinformation, this propaganda is Henry Ford, who we all probably know as the car mogul of Ford Motors. And in the early 1900s, he began an anti-Semitic newspaper that was rooted in propaganda against Jewish people. And he distributed this largely in his community, and was actually inspired by the Third Reich was inspired by his propaganda. So that is, again, an example of somebody intentionally spreading propaganda, disinformation that is harmful. And now we also we've seen in the past how it can be done with newspapers, but we've had a lot of media changes since then. The radio certainly impacted things, but cable is when things really took off, and we could have 24-hour cable channels. And now we have social media, which is 24/7. So fake news can be created by anybody. It doesn't have to be created by a media tycoon or a car mogul or politicians. It can now be created by you and me, and we certainly can be part of sharing it too. And so that's really alarming. So let's go to the next slide. I want you to be aware of some of these terms related to fake news. particularly related to fake news that we see on social media. Clickbait, going viral, hits, and traffic. Okay. So clickbait means that the more clicks that something gets, the more ad revenue it's going to generate. So, for example, if we have a flashy headline that says, "You'll never believe what the president said," or "I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw this happen." Curiosity kills the cat. People are more likely to click. They want to see what's going on, especially if that headline is with a really unflattering picture. That means that things are more likely to get more hits. So that generates traffic. Hits means the amount of time that something is clicked on, clickbait, the amount of times that something is shared, and that then creates traffic. So more hits creates larger traffic, which means it has a greater tendency to go viral. And go viral means that everybody's talking about it. It is one of the main things that you're going to see on your social media feed. If you go into Twitter, there's probably a trending hashtag about it. So everybody is talking about these terms. So let's go to the next one. So why is this happening? Why do we have fake news? What's driving the creation of fake news? Well, you probably aren't surprised to know that advertising dollars have a big part of it. Henry Ford and William Randolph Hearst, you better believe that they had advertising dollars in mind. They wanted to sell newspapers, they wanted to sell cars, they wanted to generate dollars. How do you do that? You get it through shocking headlines and, unflattering pictures that make people want to read, that are engrossing. That's not changed now. And in fact, anybody can generate advertising dollars. In 2016, the New York Times did a report about who is creating fake news. And they actually found that there were a group of teens in Macedonia who had a very struggling economy. Their families were struggling to put food on the table. It's hard to find jobs. They found a great way to make money was actually to create their own website. You can create a website super cheap now and make fake news and infiltrate it on social media. If you put ads on your website, the more people that click on your article, again, that traffic, the more hits, you create the clickbait, people want to click, they're clicking on it, that's putting ad dollars in your pocket. So people can generate advertising dollars just by creating a website and putting fake news out there. There can also be more orchestrated actors to this. The Internet Research Agency is perhaps one of the most well-known orchestrated actors in this. IRA is an organization in Russia that is quite literally operates like a business. They have a headquarters, there are cubicles for people to work in, they have tasks. It's just like going into work, except the whole goal of the job is to create fake news and to infiltrate, particularly in American politics. So each individual that works there creates a profile that looks very legitimate, and they take a polarized stance, whether super conservative, super liberal, super right, super left. And that's what I also want to say is fake news, it often gets associated with the right, with conservatives, but liberals, leftists are just as much susceptible to fake news. This isn't targeting any single group particularly, it's everybody. And so the groups at the IRA, the people at the IRA are tasked with creating profiles and creating content that align with the most extremist views, and then putting that out on social media where people like you and me see it all the time. It looks very legitimate, and that we share it, again, unwittingly. So the disinformation is being created by the IRA, and then the misinformation, people like you and me think, oh, wow, that's true. That aligns with what I believe. I'm going to share that. And so that then means that social media groups and communities crop up, because the more that people are sharing this polarized information that's rooted in fake news on their social media channels, inevitably people want to connect with other people who are just like them, who believe just like they do, who have that echo chamber. And so social media groups and communities are a place where people who believe a certain aspect then can share with each other more information and almost dig themselves deeper into this hole, because they are not getting anybody else that's critiquing them or that's questioning what they're saying. The QAnon movement, which is an extremist group, an extremist hate group, has really thrived in Facebook groups, because QAnon had some really dangerous anti-Semitic, racist content out there. And that's why it's deemed a hate group. And so many people would be talking to their relatives and their friends and their neighbors about what's going on, and how things are going to fall and get ready and things like that. And their friends and neighbors might be like, that's not right, that's weird. So they go to their social media groups where they get internal validation. That then leads to deplatforming. QAnon groups, for example, have been deplatformed from YouTube and from Facebook and Instagram. That means that they cannot operate openly as QAnon. However, they've found other ways to share their content not using QAnon hashtags. But deplatforming actually can be counterproductive, because then those groups will turn to other social media platforms like Telegram that don't have as strict guidelines. And they can actually become even more extremist there. So deplatforming it doesn't necessarily stop people from engaging with this, it just pushes them to more extremist spaces. So let's go to the next slide and let's question to ourselves, why does this matter and why should we care? Well, on the next slide, I think it's important for us to note that it's important for us to be aware of why is there this allure? And we all have it inside of us. Every single one of us feels something when we get validated with our pre-existing belief. When we're scrolling on socials and we see somebody post that says exactly what we're thinking or is aligned with what we want, that makes us feel good about ourselves, and also can give us a sense of community. So as I said, a lot of people, there was a really fascinating New York Times article about last year of somebody that was way off the deep end in conspiracy theories. This is a person who is Ivy League educated, had been on the Harvard Crimson newspaper team with Conan O'Brien. All intents and purposes, you would say this person could never fall for fake news. That's not true. Anybody can fall for fake news because of that sense of community. The more that this person became immersed with fake news, the less that their family and friends wanted anything to do with them, because it's all they would talk about. They just don't want to hear it. It's toxic. It's disrupting Thanksgiving dinner, all those things. And so this person then got deeper into the social media groups because they were the only people that would listen to her and felt like they understood her. So a lot of people go there because it creates a sense of community. It also creates a sense of order. It can feel comforting to know that there's actually some underground network that's pulling the strings here, instead of just, this is politics, this is life, this is inequity, this is what happens. And it can feel a little bit more assuring to think that there's something else going on and that you have your team with you. A lot of it can also be a distrust from the media, which is a fair thing. As we saw with William Randolph Hearst, media tycoons want to sell newspapers. They want people to watch their TV shows. They want people to subscribe to them. Clickbait gets attention. Polarized news gets attention. And rightfully so, a lot of people are just sick of that. They therefore distrust the media, and they don't want to be part of it anymore. So perhaps they feel that if they go to more independent sources, that those are more trustworthy. And the other thing is, it's simply a matter of information overload. There's a lot out there, and it can be exhausting to scroll through all of these different sources and all of these different information pieces. And by narrowing it down to your perceived network, it can feel like you're lightening the load on what you're consuming. It's also noteworthy to say that, as I mentioned, we feel something when somebody validates what we think or what we say. And so fake news really thrives on our implicit and explicit biases. The values that we claim to have, but don't necessarily act upon, are our implicit biases. And explicit biases are just the things that we feel one way or the other, whether it's right or wrong. Okay, so the next slide talks about how fake news is cultivated and created in groups. That's why it's really important for libraries to be aware of what's going on in their communities, because it's happening in our communities. It's happening in the groups that people participate in, whether they're virtual groups or whether they're in-person groups. And because people are looking for that sense of community. So that's why we need to be aware that fake news thrives in groups, because people want community. People want to be understood. People want to be heard. So while we can recognize that people want to be heard and people want to be understood, it's necessary for us to be aware of that fake news is harmful. It is wielded against marginalized communities all the time and can create harmful communities and ecosystems that allows hate to thrive. And so this is something that we should absolutely care about. It's not something that we can look away from. And because it manifests via groupthink, social media is a particular aspect that we need to be aware of and to educate our communities about, because it's so easy for people to get sucked into that groupthink just by the very nature of social media. So the last piece that I want to talk about before we bring it over to Sam is, how does this relate to the public library? So as I said, we need to be aware of this because this is happening in our communities. It can be very harmful, but also this relates directly to the role of librarianship. So the next slide talks about what information literacy is. This is a key foundation of librarianship. Information literacy is the ability to recognize when information is needed, how to be able to locate, evaluate, and use that needed information effectively. So this is an information literacy area because people want answers. People want to know what's going on. People want to be informed. They don't want to be in the dark. So that means that we have an opportunity to educate people about how they can actually locate and evaluate and use information to answer those questions that they have, but information that's credible. And then the next slide is that it's obviously a media literacy access. It's the same thing, being able to access media, being able to analyze media, being able to evaluate media. All of that is what we see when we go on TV, when we read a newspaper, grab a magazine, scroll through our social media feeds. How can we understand that what we're seeing might not be true and it might not be credible? The other thing is, to the next slide, that when we talk about getting involved in our communities and making an impact in our communities, that is worthwhile, that our investments into media literacy, information literacy, and educating people about fake news is good, because studies have shown that for every dollar that communities invest in our libraries, they get $5 back. Essentially, this is good sense for us and for our communities if we are part of these conversations and if we help create areas that and people that are educated about fake news. So before we turn it over to Sam, I think it's important to note that, as we've talked about, fake news isn't just silly, wacky stuff. It can be extremely dangerous. And that's why we need to stand up for what's right and connect with our communities and educate them about fake news.
Okay, well, thank you, Barbara, for doing that first part. So now let's transition over to how to educate our communities about fake news, about misinformation and disinformation. So what can libraries do? There are a number of things that we can do, and any of these are great ways to implement some media literacy or misinformation programming or other resources into your library. So we can do workshops or computer classes, book displays. You can get partnerships and panels, just like what Barbara and I are doing today. You can have community engagement, and you can just get your good information out there. There's a Neil Gaiman quote where he says, Google can get you 100,000 answers, but a librarian can get you the right one. And so that's part of what we do is we get good quality information. Libraries are seen as places for trusted information. And all of these examples are ways that we can do it. So I've spent the last 5 years teaching our communities on misinformation, disinformation, fake news, media literacy, and I've done it in a number of classes of about 10 to 20, maybe 30 people at a time, depending on how many people want to come. I actually have one next month that I'm teaching about misinformation and media literacy. And what I focus on is defining, identifying, and stopping the spread. So defining is what Barbara just did for us. She broke down what misinformation is, what disinformation is, what fake news is. She talked about media literacy and information literacy. And that's all defining, because before you can do anything about fake news, you need to know what it is and how it affects you. And so I break down things like misinformation, disinformation, but I also talk about things like satire. I'm sure we all have our favorite satire website or resource like The Onion. And that is technically fake news. It is not true. It is for entertainment value. But some people may not realize that, and they might consume it as factual news and share it as if that was a true headline. But satire websites are mostly well-known and make it clear that this is not real news. They are doing this for entertainment value alone. So that's part of identifying. And when I talk about identifying, I talk about identifying good quality information, talk about identifying clickbait and poor quality information, as well as satire, and also targeted advertisements on websites. That's something that I run into a lot is media consumers might not realize that that advertisement is an actual advertisement. They don't see the little ad. They don't know what the sponsored content means. And these are all simple things that you can talk about. And then lastly, I move on to how to stop the spread. And the biggest thing I tell our patrons is that by becoming a good information and media consumer, you can become a good user. And it all starts with you. If you just read that shocking clickbait headline and click share and say, I can't believe this is happening, you are complicit in sharing misinformation or fake news. But if you stop and pause and you take the skills of reading beyond the headline, looking at the sources, evaluating the website, and fact checking, you can decide if that's an article that you do want to share or not. I have often gotten asked, how do you avoid quote unquote getting political in your classes? And as we've already discussed today, fake news affects everyone and it is distributed by everyone. It is not a partisan issue only affecting one side. I also tend to avoid direct political examples. There's no need to fan those flames and get derailed. And if somebody does try to bring up some type of political argument, I just redirect the conversation, typically by saying, that's not why we're here today. Let's get back on track. Because like I said, it affects everybody and everyone can become a better consumer of information and media. If you're nervous about getting started, don't be. I have never had a major issue in one of these classes, and I've only gotten good feedback on them. And like I said, I've been doing them for 5 years now. So if you're afraid that somebody's going to stand up and start shouting at you, it hasn't happened to me, and hopefully it won't happen to you. Let's talk about some resources for educating ourselves and our community. So fact checking is a big part of being a good media consumer. And again, I teach our patrons this, of checking the URL, making sure that it's a legitimate URL and not a website that ends in .com, .co, or something like that. So just taking that extra second to look and see, is it really abc.com, or is it something that is pretending to be abc.com? You can read the About Us section on websites. If they don't have any information about who they are, who their writers are, it's probably not a good resource. You can do reverse image searches. This is something that I talk about as well, is that images are often reused to reframe an argument. And Barbara had talked about the "you furnish the pictures, I'll furnish the war." News websites do this all the time. Well, bad news websites do this all the time, where they reuse an old image, or a social media user uses an old image and then puts new context. So you could use a very old image and say, look at what the rioters are doing in this city, but the picture doesn't actually fit. And there are a multitude of reverse image searches where you can input that picture and then see where it was originally posted. Another top tip is to stop, pause, and think. So we talked about that outrage machine, that confirmation bias, and just sharing without thinking. But you need to have those skills where you read beyond the headline, read the About Us section, check the URL, do those things before just instantly sharing. And that's the biggest problem on social media, is people can just share and share and share, and before anybody is able to put a stop to it, it's been shared hundreds of thousands of times. I also provide a number of websites for fact checking. This is one issue, or this is one example where people might be a little nervous about it because they think that these fact checking websites are in themselves fake news engines. But factcheck.org, Snopes.com, and PolitiFact.com all do a really good job of having that headline or news article or quote that was attributed to somebody and explain why it's either false, true, or somewhere in the middle. And they give examples, they give credit to sources, and it's a very thorough breakdown of reading beyond that headline or quote. This is a very widely used infographic on how to spot fake news, and it's something that I print out so that patrons can take something home and have just these 8 tips of really how to evaluate resources. And it's not a ton of information. You don't have to go super, super in depth. But by walking through these 8 steps, you can be better informed. And the last one is ask the experts. And as library staff, that can sometimes be us. Again, patrons go to libraries because libraries are seen as a place for trusted information. Another resource I use are fake news games. So this one is from the University of Sheffield in the United Kingdom. And there was another one called Factitious, but I just checked that and it's no longer up. I'm not really sure what happened to it. But this one I found as a stand-in, and it's really, really great. You start it, and it was created by library staff at the university, and they pick out 3 news articles. They also do tweets and quotes, and they walk you through how to do those steps of reading beyond the headline, checking the URL, doing those things. And it's a game, so it's fun. And I walked through it. It's really interesting to see when you see it's groups of 3 headlines with just a very short story, and you read it and you go, any one of those could be false, but only one is. And it's just a really great way to illustrate to people that it's so easy to just look at a headline and go, that's got to be the false one. But when you really look into it, you can get those clues and evaluate it. All right, so that is all that I had about teaching in libraries. My last thought on that is that you don't need to go super in depth. You are not a college professor teaching this as a credited course. You are educating the general public. And in my experience, simpler is better. You want to equip them well to be good media consumers and information consumers. So giving just those brief definitions, showing them how to identify quality news and not so quality news, and then teaching them how to stop the spread is really the best way that we can do this. So I think we can open it up for any questions, unless Barbara had anything else to add here.
Yeah, so there's 2 more things that I want to add to what Sam's been talking about some ideas for you to bring to your library. In 2018, I participated in a symposium at Simmons University in Boston about fake news, and it was composed of librarians, journalists, data scientists, all of that. And we all talked about ways that we could help educate our communities about fake news. And one of the ideas was talking about creating a panel or having a workshop series at your library where you could actually invite journalists in to demystify the journalism process. And people could ask questions about how news is created, especially news in the community, and how people can understand a little bit about that backside. So consider having a panel where you can invite some local journalists, whether it's an in-person panel or a virtual panel. I'm going to find the white paper that was produced as a result of that symposium, and I'll put it in the chat. The other thing is I want to recommend this activity that I created. I wrote a chapter about news sources for a textbook for reference and reference services. And I teach a reference class actually, and I use this activity that I'll copy and paste into the chat. And I encourage you to consider how you can do this at your library, either with teens or anybody. It can be an intergenerational activity, but it's where people make their own fake news. They find a legitimate news source, they take a couple of pieces from there, they misconstrue the data or the words, and then they find a picture to go along with it, and they essentially create their own fake news so that they can have a little bit of a taste of how easy it is to make fake news. And you can also have a discussion with each other about the type of emotions that come up as a result of seeing news that either validates what you think or totally goes against it, or just is simply shocking. And so that's a helpful exercise for seeing that emotional aspect. So I will copy and paste those 2 pieces into the chat for you to consider, but we would love to take any questions that you have about what you can do to make, to educate your communities about fake news.
All right, thank you. And as Barbara mentioned, if anyone has questions, we have plenty of time to take some. So feel free to submit those in the Q&A area. You can submit those anonymously if you'd like, or you can also submit them in the chat area. Patricia's asking how you can access the recorded session. The link for that, Patricia, will be in your follow-up email, but it's typically located on the WVLS system page, and I can share the link for that too, but probably won't be ready until tomorrow. So just give us some time to do that. So a question, one of the questions that came in is, can you talk about what type of materials you would use in a fake news display at the library?
Yeah, so that can be really any type of materials that you have. I've printed out that infographic before and distributed those along with any kind of media literacy type books or other materials that we've had. You could create your own short handout about doing things like that: define, identify, and stop the spread as just short little punchy things. So it can really be whatever you want and whatever your library has, and really just kind of make it your own.
Okay, thank you. So Barbara just shared in the chat the activity that she was talking about. Do either of you have any handouts that you use in the library about all this, or have you created any, or do you know of any off the top of your head?
I haven't created any beyond what I use for our or for my sessions in the library. And really the one that I use is that that infographic a couple slides back. Let me get to it. Yeah, this one on how to spot fake news. And I can find the link to that and send that out. But it is it's written in all different languages too. So if you have more diverse communities, you can print it out in Spanish or any other language that you need as well. So I'm gonna go ahead and stop sharing my screen and find that.
So yeah, that infographic is from the International Federated Library System, and they have that infographic available as a PDF or a JPEG. One of my favorite examples of a library creating a page on their website about this is the Gail Borden Library, and I'll put the link in the chat. They created this in 2017. And it gives a really good example of how you can explain what fake news is in your community. They also have a workshop that they did, so you can get some ideas from there as well. And let me also go ahead and share that white paper that was created after the symposium at Simmons University, so that you know a little bit about more what went down and some ideas for how you can incorporate this into your library.
Awesome, thank you. As a follow-up to that, do you know if the Federal Trade Commission has links to educate people about fake news?
That's a good question. Let me just, I personally don't know if they have any links on it. Let me just do a quick search to see on their website, but I'm not sure if they do.
So another question.
Because I believe, yeah, I do know that, I mean, obviously FTC is really like their bread and butter is about scammers. So, you know, if somebody's making money off of fake news, like let's say that they are hosting workshops and encouraging people to do their online class and people have to pay money for that, or they'll be their coach or something. And again, they market themselves as a legitimate coach. And their model is based off of fake news, that would probably be something that they would address. But I don't believe that they would have just resources about spotting fake news in general.
Okay. So any tips or advice, you know, for people who are, you know, let's say working, you know, regularly work at the front desk, the public service desk or the reference desk at the library, and people are coming in and they want to use fake news to argue with the librarian about something the library is doing, let's say something in collections or something of that nature. Any thoughts on how to approach that?
Yeah, I'll let Sam share his experience, but I will say the first and foremost thing is you have to be very clear about what your library policies are, especially related to collection development. Your library needs to have a very strong collection development policy that explains how your material is selected, how it's organized, and why it's selected, and who does the selection process. Also having a very clear process if people want to challenge a book or a piece of material there. I know of some libraries that will have a standard saying you have to live in our community to be able to challenge a book. That's very important because right now there's a lot of like mass action against specific books in collections. And so a lot of people could flood a library wanting to get rid of a book when they don't even live in that city, in that town, much less that state. So being very clear that if somebody wants to challenge something going on at the library, that they need to actually be paying tax dollars and, live in that community, represent that community. The other one is having the whole process of the board reviewing it, the typical process for if a book is challenged. However, again, I've seen several libraries will have a rule saying that once a book cannot be challenged more than once in a year or 2 years or some set of time period, so that if this has been decided upon, 2 weeks later, you can't have somebody else come in and challenge it too. We're not going to go through the process. Last thing before I leave it over to Sam is having some type of agreement in there when somebody's challenging material that they have agreed that they have actually read it in totality, that they are not requesting the removal of this book based on the title, based on a review that they saw, based on somebody's Facebook comment, based on the cover, that they have actually brought it home and read it through its entirety. And they have to promise to do that. Of course, people can lie and say they didn't actually do it, but having that there alone can be a way to set firm boundaries and guidelines about that. But I'll let Sam also touch on how to handle it in the moment.
Before I get started, I did in the chat link to the IFLA infographic, and then also the fake news game from the University of Sheffield.
I just want to interject quickly, Sam, that Leah is going to there's some really great resources that Sam and Barbara are sharing. She's going to compile those onto one document and share those on our follow-up resources. So if you are unable to copy and paste all that, don't worry, we'll share that. Okay.
Great. So we actually just had somebody come in and kind of complain to one of our librarians about a material. And luckily our director is very willing to go and just talk to those patrons and walk them through our reconsideration process, which, as Barbara said, we have a form that you have to fill out. You need to read it or consume it by watching it if it's a DVD in its entirety, give reasons why it needs to be reconsidered. There's board meetings involved with it. So it is a lengthy process. It's not just you need to say you don't like it and then we'll take it off our shelves. Another question was about if somebody comes up and just starts talking about fake news or things like that. I haven't really had this happen too bad in my career so far, but I'm sure we've all had patrons who talk about things that we don't really need to have a discussion about. It's not library related. And so you can just use those kind of redirection tactics of saying, is there anything library related I can help you with today? Or kind of cut their conversation off and go like, oh, did you have a question for me? Kind of redirect from them just kind of ranting about a topic or complaining out loud about politics or whatever it is that they're complaining about.
And I think it's worth noting, we have to remind ourselves of our role, that we're information professionals. We aren't politicians. We aren't journalists. We aren't publishers. We organize information and we make it accessible. and we educate our communities about information. So being very clear about what our role is, even just to ourselves, can be helpful when we're faced with those difficult situations at the reference desk. And I think this is another piece where it would be very helpful for you to develop a system with your colleagues to lean on each other for support. Sam and I once worked at the same library together, and we had a color system there. That was in the case of sexual harassment, but it could certainly work for any type of issue, where we literally had colors that we could tell to our colleagues if we felt that we were in an uncomfortable situation. So yellow would be like, oh, I think this conversation is getting really, really uncomfortable. I think I might need some backup. And so whether we put it in our internal chat, or if somebody was walking by and I said, hey, can you grab that yellow book? That would signal to all of our colleagues, like, Barbara needs somebody to casually come up to the reference desk and hang out. Red would be like, this is a bad situation. I need the director, or I need help. Same thing, but using the color red. So coming up with a color system. And another thing that I got inspiration from a fellow librarian is coming up with a strategy where you see your colleague in a rough situation and just saying, hey, Sam, that you have that phone call that like whatever, your phone call at 10 o'clock is here. And they say, oh, sorry. Sam goes, oh, sorry, I got to go get that. I've been waiting for this call. So just having a system with your colleagues when you are in a situation where somebody doesn't respect your role as an information professional and they are treating you disrespectfully, especially if it's something related to fake news and they're not hearing you.
So to follow up, I guess, on what you and Sam are talking about, if someone comes up and is talking about fake news with you, you don't try to address that situation right then?
I'll let Sam answer his response, but mine would be, I'm not here for a debate. I can direct you to credible sources and explain why these are credible, but I'm not going to get into a debate about, about a certain topic. And if you don't want to believe that this source is credible and you aren't going to take my professional experience and degree, then I'm not going to, we only have so much capacity,
Right.
so much emotional capacity.
So if I came to you and said,
Yeah.
hey, Barbara, I heard, ivermectin or burst dewormer can be used to help COVID. I want to take.
Then I would say, oh, okay, yeah, I know that some people have heard that as well. It's been on social media a lot, but let me direct you to a couple of sources, because I've seen there's been some really credible scientific studies about that. And then if they're like, you can't believe the science, I'd say, well, these sources have been peer reviewed, and peer reviewed process is, and explain the peer review process. And if they continue, they'd say, okay, I respect your opinion, but these are the sources that I, as an information professional, that I would recommend.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And there's a line between somebody just saying, I had a gentleman come in during tax season, and he complained saying that people haven't gotten returns for the last 5 years because of, I don't know exactly what he said, the corruption in the IRS. But he was saying it as a comment in passing. And that's not something that I would get into an argument about. But if he had framed it as a question, like, I heard that this was happening to tax returns, then you can, as your librarian, you're then providing information. There was information requested. So it's just, you have to kind of see, is it just going to be a debate for debate's reasons, which is not something that we necessarily are responsible for, versus this person is asking it framed as a question and is looking for additional information on clarification. So to me, that's the dividing line.
I agree with that. An example that I have similar of when, just to cut it off, was I was teaching a digitization class, and I was explaining how we had a VHS to DVD or VHS to MP4 converter. So you could take your old VHS, your old home videos, and make them digital files. And I was teaching this workshop, I was explaining, you can do this with your own personal VHS videos, but you can't take all your old Disney VHSs from the 1990s and convert them, because that's a copyright infringement. And somebody in the audience was very upset that I said that and was like, well, the government doesn't have a right to come in my home. And and I was like, to be clear, I'm not going to be coming into like monitoring your digitization process. But, you know, if you're using our equipment, you're agreeing to follow the law, and the law says that you can't do this. And he was just going on and on about how that wasn't right. And I just kind of was like, I'm just telling you, this is what the law is. This is what copyright is. And that's the information. I'm not like, I wasn't getting into a debate about copyright law with somebody.
I'm wondering if either of you have any thoughts on, you know, Twitter having a new owner and how that could maybe impact what libraries are posting on Twitter, or just where social media could go and how that could affect libraries. I know there's been some talk with library marketers about that. Any thoughts on that?
Sam, do you have anything?
I mean, it's always interesting to see what social media is doing. I feel like they've always been a few steps behind current trends. I really hope live fact checking doesn't go away. I know there's kind of mixed reviews as to whether or not it is truly effective or not, and if that system itself is flawed. And then there's a whole First Amendment free speech debate. And I mean, we've all heard the example that yes, you have free speech, but you can't say whatever you want. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. That's not protected free speech. So I mean, in short, you need kind of those checks and balances of what is qualified as free speech and what isn't. But I mean, that's a very murky topic.
So my take on social media, and I, as somebody who, I like social media. Like, I don't use it for myself, but I like it for organizations. I actually just taught a workshop about social media for libraries last week because I think it's really powerful. The main thing that I tell any librarian who does social media is to be very careful about what you like and what you share, whether it's on your personal page or whether it's on behalf of the library. Just being very careful about what it is you're posting, what you're engaging with, and what you're sharing, and that you yourself, whether as a librarian or on behalf of the library, you are doing this due diligence that you are expecting from your patrons, that you're checking the sources, that you're taking a pause, you're not sharing or posting from a gut reaction place. So following those steps as well. And if you do post something that ends up becoming incorrect, correct it and make it known. Do a fact check on yourself. You know, if this is on behalf of the organization, or, you know, you can do whatever you want on your personal page. But I mean, if you're doing this on behalf of a library organization and you post something incorrectly, then you should absolutely address that and explain how you came to your new conclusion. So modeling that behavior.
Also, if your organization has a social media policy, either personal or for the institution, and that, I mean, it doesn't need to be something super in depth, but it can just be who is able to post on what platforms and what is acceptable posting. So for us, we don't have a formal policy at the library I currently work at, but it's known that basically all we do is post our any library related news for our library, programming and events, any updates like power's out, the library is going to be closed today, or there's an event in our parking lot, so parking is limited, things like that. And then if we share anything, it's typically only book lists, book recommendations, or some form of positive news. We're not wading into political debates, and we haven't had to address that yet. But it might be nice to have even an informal policy just so everybody's on the same page and you know who is allowed to log in and post. Obviously, you don't want to just open it up to anybody in the library.
Yeah, we started.
And going along with that policy, it can be helpful to have a policy that you post about social media usage that you put on your library's website that's aligned with a behavior policy. So what defines is hate speech or what, and if the library is allowed to delete those posts or how you can respond, things like that. So yeah, so policies can be very good.
So much more we could talk about, and so many places we could go with this. It's an interesting time, isn't it? But unfortunately, we're out of time. So I want to thank you both, Sam and Barbara, for all of the information. As we mentioned, this will be recorded. The slides will be shared. We will be sharing all the resources with you. Make sure you check your follow-up email. Also, make sure you do the survey either right after the webinar is done in a minute, or do that in your follow-up email as well. So thank you again, Sam and Barbara.
Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. Have a great day, everybody. Good luck with everything.
Thank you for participating today, and have a great day.
Bye.